We learned about the DOM. We learned how to manipulate the DOM. And then we stopped doing it, right? We started using React where we're not actually doing anything to the DOM directly. And some of you may wonder, what was the point of even learning any of that? And one of the things that I always like to do when I rely on a library or use a system, a third-party system, or something that somebody else wrote to make my job easier or to get there quicker, it's helpful to understand how they did or may have actually created that thing, whether it's a library or a framework or a service, and how it works. You'll find that just understanding how it works helps you use it more effectively. And so in learning how to manipulate the DOM, we can understand how the creators of React make their stuff work, right? So when you learn about the life cycle of a React component, you understand that at some point, there's code somewhere that's using the same methods, the same document and DOM methods that we learned about to actually modify the DOM. And so it kind of demystifies it. It's nothing really fancy or special or magic that's happening there. It's just a well put together framework that does a really good job of being very performant, and we know how it does what it does. If we needed to, and we had enough time and enough experience, we could recreate it, right? But we don't need to do that because React is really awesome. So within React, we learned about React components. We learned how to use React State. We learned how to pass data using props. We learned a little bit about prop drilling, which is essentially, and somebody just in Slack respond to this. What does prop mean? We did a little bit of a review last time about props, but what does props mean? It's okay, properties. Good. So it's just a shortened form of properties. And when you think of an HTML tag, not talking about a React component or a JSX tag, you can add properties to the tag that tells the browser, it allows you to customize how the browser might handle that tag. It's not any different than properties being passed into a function, right? So there's just data that you make available in the context of that tag. And for JSX tags, works exactly the same. We can add properties to the tag. And a JSX tag is really just a component that is defined as a function. We create a function, just a regular JavaScript function. As long as it's capitalized, we can use it as a JSX tag, and it needs to return JSX itself, right? But we can pass properties in to that function by adding them as properties on the tag, just like you would an HTML tag. So we learned about that. We learned about side effects, how they're not always a bad thing, but they can be. But React takes advantage of side effects and the fact that it can create problems, and it prevents us by getting into trouble. Prevents us from getting into trouble by forcing us to run our side effect methods during a certain phase of its life cycle. And we do that by using the useEffect hook. We've learned a little bit about hooks, and we learned about some styling techniques about CSS and JavaScript. We learned about component frameworks that we can use, or component libraries that we can use to get us there quicker, either whether it's a proof of concept or a comp that you want to do for a website, or just playing around, or if it's a simple enough application that you can use the library and you don't need detailed control over how things behave beyond what the library provides. And so we learned about a couple of different of those libraries. So today we're going to talk about single page applications, and we're going to dig into this by talking about React Router first. Okay. once the speed ETK loads, we'll go through what the objectives are for tonight. Single page application. So when we think about web applications, which is the context of our overall course, right, is developing web applications. A long time ago, when HTML was kind of a newish thing in terms of driving the internet, even before that, it was really just meant to be a document linking system, right? It was used by academics mostly. It allowed you to provide dynamic links to additional information, and people used it to allow you to get to other information related to a white paper that you'd written or a document or a thesis and whatnot. And people quickly discovered that that was not, that when we wanted to apply that technology to commerce or to things that non-academics were interested in, it wasn't sufficient. And then you started getting into applications that were written all on the server, because at the time the browser really only did one thing. It received an HTML document over HTTP, and it rendered it into something you can look at on the screen. HTML, a lot of people don't know, is really just a subset of a broader document definition syntax called SGML, which you find a lot of government sites. If you're a weirdo like me and you want to check it out, go read up on SGML. It's kind of interesting, you know, to see how XML and HTML kind of grew out of something that existed way back in the early 90s and even beyond that. So all the browsers did was they would get an HTML file in over the internet or over the network and then display it. And so in order to provide some kind of a dynamic capability to an application, that all had to be done on the server. If there was dynamic data in a database, you couldn't rely on the browser to do any lookups inside a database or across the network, because it wasn't smart enough. There was no standard for how that happened. So you started seeing what were known as CGIs. There were gateways that were created to connect a web server to a backend system. PHP kind of started to come on the scene. People used Python and other scripting languages on the back end to try to create some kind of logic. And at some point, JavaScript came into play. And even then, in the beginning, it was really very rudimentary, very limited. And so web applications as such, as they existed, really only worked on the server. And the server was the thing that had all the logic that generated fresh content. And when it generated that fresh content, it delivered it to the client as an HTML file and let the browser do what the browser was known to do, which was display HTML. Then Web 2.0 happened. I'm giving you guys a little bit of a history lesson. You probably don't need to know any, if not all of this, but when things started to progress and people began to realize that, and Google was really a big driver of this in a lot of ways, when they started to develop an operating system that ran in the browser essentially. And you got a lot of really smart people digging on how can we basically leverage the internet and the infrastructure of the internet, but also leverage all of the processing power that exists and all of the devices that are connected to the internet. Every person that was viewing a web page had a massive computer sitting in their hand or on their desktop that was doing nothing but taking text and rendering it into an image. And it was capable of doing much more. Meanwhile, people on the back end were struggling to figure out, how do we scale our applications so that they can serve thousands, if not millions, if not hundreds of millions, and even billions of people? Well, part of the answer for that is, don't make the server do everything. Let the client do a lot of it. And sophisticated capabilities inside browsers kind of grew out of that. And so now we have something that is known as a single page application, which essentially means that the server does deliver. You still have to connect to the server with the browser, and it has to deliver information to you. But what it gives you is one page. if you want to consider it that way. You just get one. And with that, all of the code and information needed to have a full-blown application. Now, the application doesn't have all the data that it needs. So in order for it to still be useful and somewhat dynamic, it still needs to go out over the internet, but not for look and feel user interface elements, right? So it's just for data, just hitting APIs to retrieve data. Everything else, user interface transitions, interactions with the user, feedback back to the user, visual elements, media, all of that stuff can be done directly in the memory of the local machine. And all the server had to do was deliver a single page to make that happen. Okay, so that's essentially what we mean when we talk about single page applications. And one of the key things in the React atmosphere that drives that is a module called React Router. Okay, and React Router allows us to perform routing on the client side. So we can talk about routing on the server side, we can talk routing on the client side. If you've ever studied about or know anything about networking, the term routing means something completely different. If you've worked for the post office, the word routing means something completely different. It's kind of an overload term. If you're from Canada, you don't even say routing, you say routing. So routing is a thing that we can talk about on the client side or the server side. I've got a Slido poll that I want to post. And a typical question you might think would come out of the training kit, and for me to kind of test your knowledge and give you a chance to think about it, might be, what is client-side routing? Because we're all fairly familiar with server-side routing. But I decided to ask the question a little bit differently. I wanted to focus on the word routing. So if you'll check on Slido, I've posted the question. The question is, what is routing, whether client or server-side? So when we talk about routing, what are we talking about? Okay, I'll give a chance for some results to roll in. You guys get to view a beautiful word cloud as it builds, so the more input we get, the better. Okay, the path the data takes, I like that, providing a path or a map. Saying what web page to load, okay, moving from one thing to another, I like that. It's more of a generic view, but it kind of describes what happens within the application, okay. Going somewhere, traffic direction, depends on how you define traffic, but that could also apply, okay. Switching between pages, creating a path for the data, okay. And of course we could say the data or some data or just data. I think you guys are all kind of getting the drift here. So when we think about routing on the server in this context, really what it means is what experience is the server going to provide to the user based on the request that the user made. Okay, now the user doesn't always formulate. In fact, most of the time the user doesn't actually formulate the request except for the very first thing they type in, www.google.com, right? And then from then on, it's mostly clicking on links. And so they're making requests, but they don't have any idea what the content of that request is. It's in the form of a URI, known as a Uniform Resource Identifier, or sometimes also known as a URL, Unified Resource Locator. There have been land wars fought over which one is more accurate, so I'm not going to get into that. I have an opinion, but it doesn't matter what it is. But it's either URI or URL. And it basically is an instruction to the server about what to provide back to the user, or more accurately, what to provide back to the browser. So when we think about client-side routing, it's really not any different. The only difference is that that request never hits the network. We're not sending the request to the server. The request stays within the application. But in order for it to work, we need some kind of intelligent system that can look at what the request is, the URI or URL, the link, that can look at what that request is and make a decision about what to display or what to do because of it. When we think about React, we have components. Those components are functions that simply modify the DOM. and or cause React to modify the DOM more accurately. And what we want to be able to do is have some kind of a system that can see what is being requested and choose what component to show. That's essentially what React Router is. Now, as you start digging into all the complexity that can go into making a web application work and how different things work, including the history API in HTML5, as well as links and other things, then React Router gets a little bit more to it than just what I described. But at its heart, what I just described is what React Router is for. It's to allow us to have an application that can still work within the confines of the browser and still work the way a web application works, and take requests and route back to the user an experience based on what that request is. Okay. So tonight, what we're going to dig into, thank you for answering that question, by the way. What we're going to dig into, these are our objectives. We're going to be able to explain the purpose of client-side routing. We're going to be able to add React Router to an application that's essentially adding it as a dependency and then importing it, and understanding what there is in the package and how we import what's in the package. Be able to describe the route component and set up routes within an application, use the link component to navigate between routes, and then create dynamic routes using URL parameters and what's known as the match object. And we'll learn about what all that means tonight. The TK was pretty rich, so a lot of this might seem like review to you, but that's awesome because that just means you'll understand it even that much more. Please take an opportunity to ask questions if you have them. We'll be digging into those as well. Okay, so let's talk about why. So in addition to some of the things that I just mentioned, being able to use local resources, what are some other benefits? I've had a difficult time. I mean, actually, well, I'll do it as a word cloud. I can't seem to get open text questions to work in Slido, so I'm just going to do it as a word cloud again. Okay, so the question is, what are the benefits of client-side routing? If you'll check Slido, we'll start that up and give you a minute to just respond to that. What are the benefits? Why would we prefer client-side routing? You can repeat some of the things that I've mentioned, or if you've got some other things in mind, feel free to mention what those are. Okay, offline mode is an interesting one. I like that answer, but it doesn't really apply to single page applications as much as to another class of what amounts to a single page app, but for some reason the name is escaping me. There's a different kind of app that kind of works the same way, but is optimized for offline experience. No need to reload the page. I like that. Less resources, no page refresh, faster load times. Okay, so you get a faster, smoother experience. We'll have a chance to see kind of how that plays out tonight. Less stress on the server, of course. Client-side routing can be faster than server-side routing. Okay, so good. So you get a lot of that really goes into what the user's experience is. Okay, and if we can leverage the local computing power and provide a really smooth experience, then there's all kinds of psychological things that go into why you want to have that in terms of helping people be successful with whatever it is you're trying to help them with, whatever your app does. Okay, so good. These are some really good answers. I'll have to look up what that other, for some reason I can't, it's just escaping me. All right. All right, so so those are some of the purposes for client-side routing. So let's dive into our project. I'm going to share this with you. Let's see. I'll drop this in Slack. If you can open that and then fork it, then you'll be able to follow along. So in tonight's project, what we're going to do is we're going to create a little shopping website. Okay, so typically with a shopping website, you've got some data and some items that are for sale. In this case, we're pulling information out of a static array that is housed in this file called data.js. And in this, it's an array of objects, and each object has a name, an ID, a price, an image URL, a description, and some shipping information. And there aren't a ton of them, but you get kind of the idea. So this will be enough for us to be able to do what we need to do. Similar pattern to what we've done in the past, whether it's with movies or dogs. We're going to set up kind of a card type of a format. Okay, with this information. So if we look at our index file, we've got an app component. It's defined here in the index file itself, right? So here's our app function. In the past, we've actually had this be a separate component file, but it's small enough and simple enough that we don't need to do that here. And we have these others. So one of the things that we want to do is we want to focus on the router. So we're going to save you some typing. We've got a home component that basically displays our home page. It's not showing now because we don't have a way to show it. One thing that we could do is that we could simply put that home component right here, right? So if we were to components home, and then down here in our div, we could do like that, and then it would show our home component. So that's one way we could do it. The challenge with that is that it's always going to be there, right? And that may not be the experience that we want or exactly what we want to create. Actually, I think this is supposed to be below our nav bar, so like this. So if you can imagine, at some point we want to be able to display items for sale here, and we kind of want this this home component, whatever it's made of, to go away, to not be there. So we could create all kinds of logic in here to determine, what's the state of our application and what we need to display. But it turns out that with React Router, we don't have to do that because we've got tons of other capability that it can provide for us. So we'll be looking at how we're going to do that here, how to show our home component and how to show an item list. Okay, so you can see here that the item list retrieves the items array from our data file, and then it maps over that item array. And for each item, it creates a div that contains the image and the price and the name, right? And then we'll display that. Okay, so that's our item list component. And then we also have an item component. It's currently commented out. We'll get a chance to get into this, but what we want to be able to do from our item list is maybe click on a particular item and then have the details of that item show up. Okay, so that's essentially what we're looking at here. And so most of this has been provided. We're going to do some modification here as we learn how to use React Router to make this happen. Okay. Wants me to zoom in. Give me just a minute. I keep forgetting that I need to do this. I come to settings, font size, 20. Okay, so hopefully that'll help with the reading. All right. So that's essentially it, right? So we're gonna, and by the way, the title here you can customize. I put SK's Emporium of Awesome. You can make it be whatever you want. So let's take a peek. So since we're not going to use home here, I'm going to go ahead and remove this. Okay. By the way, this project came with React Router DOM pre-installed. If you, when you get to the project, where did that go? There we go. Okay, when you get to the project later today, when you download it and you need to get going with it, you're going to you're going to have a project that doesn't have all the packages that you need, but it has a list of what packages you need, and that list is in the package.json file. Okay, so it's listed here in dependencies. Okay, now there's a shortcut for how to get all of these dependencies downloaded. So you could open this and read it and manually one by one do a yarn install or a yarn add for each one of these. But instead of doing that, you could just simply type yarn, and yarn will go through and read those dependencies and bring them in for you. Okay, so once you download it, you can do that. And if your dependencies includes the React router, then you're fine. And if it doesn't, then you're simply going to do yarn add React router DOM. Okay, it turns out that there are different versions of React router for different targets of where your application is going to be running. If it's going to be running in a browser where it's manipulating the DOM through React, then you want the React Router DOM version. If it's going to be running on a native, as a native application on a phone or a tablet, then you want a different React Router instance to be installed if you're working with React Native. So React Router DOM is the one that we want because we're running in a browser and working with the DOM. Okay, so you would do that, and then it would be installed. Okay, let me. Okay. So here in Code Sandbox, it's already been added to our project, React Router DOM. And so what we want to do is we want to use this to be able to access the different parts or components within React Router. So the nice thing about React Router is that every different element that you work with in React Router is itself a component. Okay, so we know how to import components from component libraries, and we know how to use them as tags, and that's pretty much all that we're going to be doing here. So if you go to the React Router documentation, if you do Google React Router, you'll find that it's at reacttraining.com. There's a number of different components that you can learn about. The one that we're going to focus on, one of a few that we're going to focus on tonight, is route and router. Okay, when we look at router, it's actually a base component for a number of different types of routers. You can read about what these other routers are for. Hash routers for legacy browsers that don't support HTML5. Memory and native you typically would use for either backend or native applications, and static has special use cases. But for most uses, you would use the browser router, okay, as a component. And so if we were to look at this component, it's a router. So the router, again, is the base that uses the HTML5 history API. And there's some information here about how to use it. One of the things that the browser router gets us is access to certain properties or props on all of our components, or actually any of its child components that provide access to information about the route or the routing or the URL or the history. And these are things that you can use to help drive logic within your application. Okay, so what's typical is what you see here, where your main application component is wrapped in a browser router component. Okay, that's typically what you would see. In the TK and in some other videos that I've seen, people typically will import the browser router component, but they'll rename it to router just because it's easier to type. But for me, and this is just my personal preference, because React Router library contains a component called router, I prefer to just leave it as browser router. I don't mind the extra characters, plus there's autocomplete and other things that save my wrist and my fingers, so I don't have to worry too much about it. But that's optional for you. This is basically how you would do it. Now that I've got it added as a dependency, React Router DOM, I'm going to do a named import. Okay, from React Router DOM, I'm going to import a browser router. Now, if you wanted to rename it, then the way that you would do that as a named import is inside the curly braces, you would put as whatever name you wanted to call it. Again, a lot of people call it router. You could call it my router, whatever you wanted to call it. Then you'd be able to use this name, for your component. And again, you're welcome to do that. I'm not going to do that just because my own personal preference is to not do that. Okay, so here we're importing it. Now that we've got it imported, we can use it. And again, the pattern that we want to follow is we want to wrap our app component, and therefore every other child component needs to be under our browser router, so that these particular properties that browser router wants to make available, it can do so. I used the term before called prop drilling, and we've talked before about how prop drilling works. It's a prop drilling effect, but in reality, and I'll just mention this, and if you're curious, you can go learn more about this. We've learned about hooks in React. We've learned about the use state and use effect hook, and that there are many other hooks. There's another type of hook called the context hook that is another method for sharing data or information between parent and child and descendant components. And that's the technique that the browser router uses. But ultimately, what it really means is that the browser router is able to provide contextual information about the state of the application to all of its children components, including all of our components that we create. And so in order to make that happen, we want to wrap our top level app component in browser router. Okay, and so it creates our closing tag for us. I'm going to cut it and then paste it after app. And then when I save this, it reformats it for me. Okay. Now, not much changed really. You don't get this. You don't see a ton here. In fact, you don't see anything in terms of this display. But there's some things that have happened behind the scenes. So I'm going to open our application in a new window. There's a button there in Code Sandbox over here that'll split it out into a new window. You may have noticed if you've tried to do any inspection of your application within the Code Sandbox user interface, then there's a ton of stuff here that has nothing to do with our app, right? And it gets really messy. And so if you split it out so that it's its own page, and then you get a much cleaner view of your application, okay? Now, one of the things that you can install with the browser is a React Components debugger, and in here it gives you the ability to see your component hierarchy. Okay, so with what's on the page and what's been defined, and so here you can see our browser router, and you can see a router object and a router.provider component. inside of which ultimately is our app component. Okay, and as we create other components, you'll see them show up here as well, and you can see kind of the hierarchical nature here. So even though we don't see a lot happening here, just by wrapping our app in a browser router, you know, we get some things, and we're going to come back to this and look at more of this as our application grows. Okay. Some of the things, for example, when you look at this, if you look at these properties, you'll see history. It's got a bunch of information as well as some methods that we can use to control the flow of our application. There's a location object that has information, and then a match object, which we're going to rely on later to be able to pull parameters out of the URL. Okay, so these are the properties that become available to us, and you can see that they're managed by the browser router and its other constituent components. Okay. Let's see, any questions in Slido? So we'll continue on. Okay, so now let's take a peek at the next component in React Router. Okay, it's all alphabetical, so I could just scroll down here. And we'll see that, as it says here, the common low-level interface for all router components is, actually I didn't mean router, I meant route. Okay, the route component is perhaps the most important component in React Router. As I mentioned before, this is kind of at the foundation of what this whole thing is about. Its most basic responsibility is to render some UI, or we could fill in there with components, when its path matches the current URL. When we say its path, we're talking about the route component's path. And so what is the route component's path? How do we access it or know what it is? That's a question you can answer in Slack. Okay, when it says its path, the route component's path, what is that? There's a little bit of a clue over here. Okay, so it's an address. It is a URL, but most specifically, the route component's path is its path property. Gary got it, right? I think you guys are all kind of circling around it. It is a prop, as Denton says, right? So it's a property of the route component. So when we talk about its most basic responsibility is to render some component when its path, meaning the one that we gave it when we typed it into our code, matches the current URL. Okay, so basically, it takes a path property and a component property that allows us to specify. I'm just going to scroll down here. Okay, here's the path property. Is any valid URL path or array of paths that path to regex understands. So this is another component or package that is able to determine if a particular string matches another string. Okay, so they're using this as a dependency. As it says here, routes without a path or without a path property always match. Okay, so again, the route component's main job, its basic responsibility is to render some other component when its path or path property matches the current URL. So it's using that other package to determine that match. And so we can type in any path that that we want that can potentially match or be used to determine if there is a match. Okay, so those are the two main things that we really care about with respect to the route. Is what is the route we're trying to match to, and what component should show up or be displayed when that route is in the URL. Okay, so let's go back to our code. And if we want to use this component, we need to import it. Okay, so we're going to import browser router and route from React Router DOM. And we're just going to use it like this. Route path equals, and let's say our first path is just going to be the home path. Okay. And we need to specify a component. And when you do, remember that this is just a component itself, which means that there's a function somewhere that defines the route component. And these parameters that we type in are going to be passed into that function. This is going to be passed in as a string. Remember, the props parameter of that function is an object that contains all of these properties as other sub-properties. And we can pass in objects, and we can pass in functions, right? So in this case, we want to pass in an actual object. So not the name of an object, but an actual object. But in this case, we're actually going to pass in a function. Remember that in JavaScript, functions are first-class objects, right? So every function is an object. But because we're going to be passing in an instance of an object, we need to use the curly braces, right? So this here we're reaching into the JavaScript world from within the JSX world, and we're going to pass in a variable that contains or points to a function. And in this case, it's going to be our home component, which really is going to be a method, right? But in order for that to work, we need to import it. This is no different than every time we've defined our own component before and then exported it and then come to some other place like index here and imported it. Our home component is in the components folder, and it's just called home. Okay. And I put this outside of the div, so it doesn't like that, so we'll put it inside. Okay. Remember that when you return JSX, it's got to, if it's not a fragment, it has to be within a container. Okay, so here we have this route that shows a path and a component that's going to be displayed. And now when we save it, so basically what will happen is where this statement is, this component will be displayed if this path matches the URL. Okay, so the location of the route matters because that is the place where our component, the one that we're pointing to, is going to be displayed. So in a sense, you can kind of view this as React Router's if-then statement, right? So we don't have an if-then syntax in JSX, but essentially what this is going to do is if it's going to do an if-then. If the URL matches this path, then display this component in this location, okay? And this is the component we want to display. So as soon as I save this, it's going to re-render, and because we are at the root path, we'll see that our home component is going to now be displayed, okay? So hopefully this is making sense. See if there's any questions. Nope. Okay. All right. So now that we have this in place, we can take a peek at our tools over here. And if we look at our app now has a child component. It itself is a route with a consumer and a provider, and then we can see our home component, okay? And remember, these properties that I mentioned before that are being created and maintained by the browser router can be propagated down to our own components. So if we look at our home component, we'll see that we have access to them here. Okay, and we can examine them and look at them, different information. Again, these are methods. So it's a prop, it says props. So if we were to go into our home component and look and see we're retrieving props, right? We'll put a debugger statement there, save it, And then when we hit it, we can take a look at the props that are being passed to our home component function. And here we can see these properties. Now, when we look at our use of the component, right here, we're not passing any properties to it, right? There's a particular way or method that you can use to pass properties to components that are being rendered by route. We're not going to cover that today, but whatever that method is, we're not doing it. So we're not passing anything in as properties, and yet the home method is retrieving or receiving these properties. For those of you that can't see small, let me see if I can make it a little bigger. Okay. So again, if I hover over props here, we can see that there are some objects that came in the props parameter, right? So if we look at them, match, for example, we can see the URL and the path, if the URL was an exact match or not. Under location, we have some other information. Path name is duplicated here. So it gives us the ability within our function to have some information around how we ended up in this place, so that we can make some decisions about what we want to do from here. Okay. Take that debugger statement out. All right. All right, we're going to continue on, but it's time for a break. So we're going to do a quick 5-minute break, and then when we come back, we'll dive into adding additional routes to our application that we can use. In particular, we're going to add one that allows us to show the item lister to go shopping, basically, right? So let's do a 5-minute timer. And in 5 minutes, we'll be back and continue on. Okay. So let's jump back in. Now that we have our home component showing, and this is not a very exciting home component, we didn't put a lot on it, but we're not trying to win any contests with this here. So once we've got this in place, we want to be able to show our item list. Okay, so again, if we look at what our item list does, it's importing an array of items from our data file, and then it's returning JSX that has a list of divs, and that list is created by mapping over that array. And for each item, you know, we get our key, the image URL with the alt tag, or the alt property rather, the item name, and the price. Okay, and it's all in a div that is of the item list wrapper class. And if we look at our styles.css, we can see that there are certain properties. You know, it's a flex display, flex box with the wrap. So we're going to get some of that coming through as we work with it. Okay, so that's what our item list component does. What we want to be able to do is conditionally display that. And so we've learned how to use the route component to use the URL to determine when that particular component would be displayed. So we're going to do the exact same thing here, right? Route path equals, we've got some options here. I'm going to just choose item list as the URL. And the component I want to display is the item list component. Okay, which it's underlined in red because it's not defined, and it's not defined because I haven't imported it. Okay, so now we can save this, and you'll notice when we save it and our application reruns, we don't have an item list showing. Okay, and that's because it's conditional. It's conditional on the URL. Okay, so notice that what we put in our path is a relative URL. In other words, what comes after the host name, right? So we can test this by just typing in item list, and you'll see we then get our flexboxed flowy wrapping list of items. Okay, and again, all that the item list is showing is the image followed by the name followed by the price. So that's what we get: the image followed by the name followed by the price. Okay, and the div that those things are in is an item card, which has its own styling. Okay, so we can see that this is our item list, but what else is showing on this page in addition to our item list? You can answer in Slack. So we've got this item list component, but what else is showing on the page? Okay, the home component. Right, that's what this was up here. We can see in our home component, we've got this image followed by a button. Okay, now the home component is being displayed after a nav tag that has a header and then a div, nav links div. Okay, so then we get our home component and our item list component. So why is the home component showing when our URL is /item list? Right, so because it matches, right? It has the / and it matches. Okay, so somebody suggests, Natalie suggested, because we didn't specify exact, right? So if we come back to the the route component, we can see that one of the properties that we can pass is exact. And exact, when it's true, will only match if the path matches the location.pathname exactly. Okay, so if we come over here and we take a peek at our components, we can see here that we've got the item list component, and we will look at location path name. Okay, so that's what it says, location.pathname. When we look at the documentation, if exact property is true, it'll only match if the path matches the location.pathname exactly. Okay, so let's see. What that might mean is that maybe, could we put exact here? That didn't seem to work. Okay. Sometimes when you go through the process of trying to figure out string matching, you kind of have to think through what the software is thinking. Okay, so they gave us a clue in the documentation here. When we looked at path, it says any URL that this particular package will understand. And so it might be helpful in your spare time to go check out this package and see what it's doing, right? Regular expressions is a topic that I believe every developer needs to understand. It's complicated. It can be frustrating. It's got a very weird syntax. It's got an ancient history, but it is pervasive. You'll find it everywhere, including here. That's what regex means. It's regular expressions. So it's worthwhile trying to understand that, just so that when things like this kind of thing come up, you can kind of reason about and understand what it's trying to do in order to determine if something matches or not. Okay, without going through all of the details of that, what we know we need to do is actually put that exact flag on the home path. Okay, so if I save that, then when we come back over here to our item list, we can see now that the home component is missing because this URL does not match the path exactly for the home component. Okay. This is just a property. Notice that we're not setting it equal to true. Its mere existence is truthy, and that's all that's needed. Also notice that it doesn't have to exist in front of path. It can be anywhere in the opening JSX tag. It's just a property. Okay. So if the exact property exists, then that will apply. Okay, so now we've got a second route. Over here, we're not seeing our item list because in this instance, we're not, we don't have the item list URL. If we were to type it in, then it would do the same thing. Okay, so we're kind of getting there. It's not very nice to force users to type in the URL that they want. They're not used to doing that. In addition to that, we may want our application to be able to run completely devoid of any browser Chrome. And when I say Chrome, I'm not talking about Chrome the browser. I'm talking about all of this stuff, the tabs, the URL box, the what they call the omnibox in Chrome, the bookmarks, all these different extensions, these buttons here, the navigation buttons. We may want our user to experience our application without any of that. And most modern browsers will support a Chromeless operation where you can make your app, the boundaries of your app, be the only thing that they see. But then if you do that, they don't have the ability to navigate back or forward through the history. So in addition to being able to get to things like this page from the home page, as well as being able to navigate back and forth, we want some capability to direct the browser's current URL, right? To basically issue a request. Again, these requests are not going over the network and they're not going to a server. They're going to be observed through the history API and through the DOM by React Router, which will then use all of the route components that we've entered to make a decision about what to do, to look for a match, right? So the component that we want to use next is called link. Okay, the link component has a number of different properties that it can take. We're only really going to focus on this one though. Okay, it's a string that represents the link location. And so this is kind of the opposite of what route does. So when route has a path name or a path property, route is saying I'm receiving that. So whatever is entered, I'm going to act on it. Whereas link in its to property is saying I want this to be pushed. I want this to be, you know, the truth. And whatever the URL is now, make it be this. Okay. What link does is it ultimately renders down to an anchor tag, and we're going to take a peek at that here in just a minute. Okay, so again, a number of other properties. You're welcome to learn about them as you have more time to do that, but right now we're just going to focus on this to property, which basically takes, as it says here, or as it looks like here, a relative URL. Okay, so on the reverse side, we have a route that works with this relative URL. So what we need is a link that can make this URL be active so that this route can then have a match instead of making the user type it in. Okay. All right, so the way that we want to do that is we're going to import, in addition to route, the link component. Okay, and we have a div here that that we can use to contain our links. Okay, so this is a container that's in this nav section, which is this area up here. Okay, and so what we can do is type in link. Well, we put to, let's say we want initially one to be just to go back to home. Okay. And then we will want another one. As I mentioned, we already have a relative path here. So we could just use that same one, right? Okay, and you can call it whatever you want. This is just text that gets displayed to the user, whereas this is a URL. And this could be anything you want as well, as long as these match. When I click on this, it's going to make the URL be this. And if it matches this, then this component will be displayed, right? So we'll demonstrate that here in just a minute. So I'm going to save this, and we'll see now that we get, oh, what did I do? Okay, so now we've got these links up here on this nav tag, our nav bar, that we can click on. Okay, and if we, let me get rid of this. If you look down at the bottom here, I'm sorry, but I can't make this part bigger. It's just Chrome does what it does with that, but you can see the relative URLs that show up here. Okay, so you'll notice that if I were to manually type in item list, okay, so we're using React Router, we're using React and React Router, and a lot of the benefits of client-side routing that people mentioned is that you don't get the refresh, right? You don't get the full page refresh. So keep your eye on this location here. I'm going to type in this URL. I don't know if that comes through, but what did you guys see there? Did you see a full refresh? I don't know how that came across on Zoom. Somebody tell me what you saw there. I'll do it again just so that you can see if you weren't watching it. I'll go back to home. Okay, so full page refresh. Okay, arbitrariness for the win, like that. Okay, all right, so we get a full page refresh. There's a reason for that. Okay, but we've talked about the benefit being not. So now if you click on the links, however, let me click on the shop link and tell me what you see. Tell me if you saw a refresh there. I'll go back to the home page, back to the shop, back to the home page. There's no refresh, right? But it's different if I type it in up here. Okay. Another thing that we can do to kind of demonstrate, and I'm getting to a point here and I'll show you, inside this nav link, I'm going to put another one, and I'll just do an anchor tag. Okay, so now if we look at the app, I have the shop and the shopping. And if you look down at the bottom, you can see that the URLs are identical for both of them, right? If I click on shop, there's no refresh, it's instantaneous, right? But if I click on shopping, I get this full page refresh. Who could tell me why that might be happening? Take a guess. It's just a guess. Okay, DOM manipulation. Okay, so in one instance we can say DOM manipulation is happening, and in the other instance it's not, right? Actually, DOM manipulation is happening in both instances, but it's a matter of what exactly is being manipulated and how. Okay. Okay, so the omnibar makes a network request. Okay, that's one way to look at it, but think about the fact that when I change the URL here, there is nothing's hitting the network, right? So if I were to type it in the browser bar, there's no network traffic. In fact, we can see that here. If we look at, let me pull this down and clear this, and I'll go to item list. The only thing that we're going to see here is the retrieval of, actually no, because it's not on, yeah, it's image URLs that we should see come down. Okay, and there's some Babel things that we're not in control of. None of this is part of our request, though. There's not a server to send our request to. Okay, and likewise, if I were to clear this, let me go back to the home page and clear this and click on shop. Okay, you see that it just it all comes through like that directly without any network traffic. Okay. Other requests or other ideas, the router, the href is server side. It takes longer because the exact isn't coming into play here at all. It's a good guess though. The router prevents the refresh and the omnibar doesn't. Okay, but here I have this link as well, right? So if I go home, I'm not using the omnibar when I click on this link, and I still get a full page refresh. Okay. So all of the stuff that you see coming down here, the Babel information, the sandbox information, none of this has anything to do with my app, but it is being retrieved. And it is because when an anchor tag is processed by the browser's behavior is to empty the DOM completely and then send a request out to wherever that request is going, retrieve information that needs to be rendered in the DOM, and then re-render the DOM. So it wipes the slate clean. We literally see that when we do this, that it gets completely emptied and recreated. Okay, but I mentioned before that these link tags from React Router are ultimately rendered to an anchor tag. Okay, and to demonstrate that, If I click on elements here, let me actually use this pointer. And if I click on this, so if I don't click on it, but point at this particular thing here, this is being rendered by a link JSX tag, but in the DOM, it is an anchor tag, okay? I'm pointing at the screen, but you can't, if you look on the right-hand side, the bluish outlined box down below where it is surrounding that anchor tag with an href of /item list and the text of shop, okay? So it's an anchor tag, and it's not any different than this anchor tag, other than the text, okay? One of them says shop, the other one says shopping, but they both are just anchor tags. But there's a subtle difference that between these two that's being managed by React Router, okay? And it's something that we learned about before when we learned about DOM events, okay? There's when you look at an event like a click handler, for example, the event is passed into the event handler, and there's something we can do with that event to change what the browser does with the event. Does anybody remember? Here's the code, by the way. I just have these two link tags and then an A anchor tag. Okay, prevent default. Great, you guys got it. Prevent default, right? So if I'm looking at my application here, and to kind of demonstrate this, what I'm going to do is, let me come back to sources here. So I'm just going to do a quick demonstration of something. If I were to look at let's see, query selector A is going to get me the first link on the page, which is this home link, right? What did I type wrong? Query select. Oh. No, it's query selector. Oh. Okay. So now if we look at my link, you'll see it's just an anchor tag, right? Let me clear that so we can see it a little more easily. And we can see it's the home anchor tag. And the href just points to the /, right? So now what I can get is get event listeners from my link. Okay, so when I call this method, it returns an array of all the event listeners on that tag or that DOM element. And in this case, we only have one, and it's a click event, right? So I have the ability. Now, you'll notice that in our code for this link tag, we didn't specify an event handler. Okay, we didn't create one. I've not specified one anywhere. And so something somewhere under the covers after React Router and React got a hold of my JSX tag and my component here has added an event listener for the click event. We can see it here, right? So I've got my tag or my element out of the DOM, and then I retrieve with this method called getEventListeners all the listeners that there are for that, and there is one, and it's a click event listener. So somebody created it. And using the debug method, I can actually put a breakpoint on that listener. Okay, so whatever the code is, I can actually stop on it and have a peek at it and see what it is, even though I didn't create it. Right? It's not I'm not the one that created it. So now I've got this debug statement in place, and it's going to stop. And we'll see up here when this event handler for this tag, which is this home tag here, executes. So all I need to do is click on this, and we see it stops on this function. Okay, What is this function doing? First of all, what's the name of the function? Okay, no idea. So this is just JavaScript. If you look at it, this is a function definition all on one line. Okay, so some of you've got it. This is the name of it here. You could pronounce it noop, but I'm old school, so I'm going to pronounce it no-op because that's essentially what it is, right? It comes from the realm of assembly language. A no-op is basically an operation that does nothing. Okay, so it's a no-op. So this is basically the JavaScript method to say, I don't want you to do anything. Okay. Now, what's interesting about this is that the built-in behavior of the browser for an anchor tag is not to do nothing, right? The built-in behavior of an anchor for an anchor tag in the browser is to send a request to a server and retrieve it, or retrieve whatever the server sends back, right? So somehow our click event handler for this home anchor tag has been pointed to this no-op function, so that when we click on it, the default behavior doesn't occur. This is what happens when you call e.preventDefault, right? So when you do a click event handler and on the event you call the prevent default method, this is essentially what happens is it points that handler to this no-op function where nothing happens, right? So if we were, let's let this continue. If I were to click on this shop link, you'll see it breaks again on the same function. So both of them point to the same function and it does nothing. Okay. So what the browser will do when it sends a request is it'll completely empty the DOM. It'll wipe the slate clean and then wait for the response to come back to figure out what to fill it up with, right? But by saying prevent default, React Router has given us an anchor tag that prevents the browser from wiping the slate clean. That's what makes the experience so smooth, right? So I'm going to take this breakpoint off. Now you can see when I click on this, there's no wiping of the slate. The DOM doesn't get emptied because we're preventing the browser from doing what the browser normally does. Okay. Whereas when I click on this, so let me put that thing back in. Okay, so now we've got this break on that same no-op function, but if I click on my shopping link, we don't get to the breakpoint. Okay, and the reason we don't get to the breakpoint is because this link doesn't go through this function. Okay, so here's the code. Sorry, I'll post this as well. It's just an anchor tag, right? So so Tim asks, why don't we just call no-op? And what is the no-op function doing? Oh, that was my question. Okay. So why don't we just call no-op? First of all, I don't know for certain that this is a built-in function. This might be, in fact, this is in React DOM's code. So unless we have React DOM included and React DOM is publishing that function, we can't call it, but we could make our own. We could do that. I will say as well that if you specify the click event handler to do nothing, I don't think that stops the browser from doing its normal thing. You have to call prevent default, I think. That might be an experiment somebody could try and report back. Okay. Let's see. All right. So hopefully this is making sense that what happens with these link tags under the covers is that there's a prevent default on the click event for the anchor tag. So again, if we look at these elements, we'll expand this out in the nav container in these nav links. We just have 3 anchor tags. 2 of them were created because of the link JSX that we got from React DOM, that component, and one of them was created because we used a native or a built-in React JSX tag for the anchor tag, which just gets rendered as a plain anchor tag, right? And this one doesn't have the special behavior of not doing the default. That's why when we click on it, it wipes the slate clean, whereas when we click on these others, it doesn't. All it's doing is manipulating the DOM in memory. It's much faster and a much better experience. This one as well has to go back out and retrieve all of the stuff that the application needs. There's different support files. There's a JavaScript file, another JavaScript file, another one, another one, another one. Okay, so right at the present, we have all of these already, and there's no need to re-download them, so that's why we don't have to hit the network. But the default behavior of the link tag is to start over from scratch, which means it's got to go get all that stuff again, okay? So you can kind of start to see the power of creating really great applications using React Router. Okay. All right. So that's the link tag. I'm going to get rid of this extraneous anchor tag because it's lame, and these ones are not. I'll put in my notes the functions that I use to allow me to put a debug breakpoint up on an event handler that I didn't create. Just some of you may find that interesting, but it'll be in the notes. So if you're curious about that, you'll have access to that. All right, so the last thing we want to do in our application is we want to make it so that when we click on one of these things, we get details about that particular item. We want it to pop up, fill the screen, or take up, be the focus of our attention and provide us with additional information besides just the name and the price, okay? So a couple of different things we're going to do here. Obviously, we're going to need a link tag, right? We can tell that by clicking on this. We want the link tag to make a change to the URL, and then we know we're going to need a route component, right? So that when the URL changes, we load a different component. And in this case, the component we're going to load is this item component, okay? So I've got it commented out. Most people are familiar with the double forward slashes as a comment for a particular line. But when I've got a big chunk of text to comment out, I use these this comment syntax. And so all you have to do is delete the first and last line, and then we're back in business. Okay. But there's some problems here. You can see that within this component, the code references something called an item, okay, and then pulls information off of that to create this div that has all the information that we want to show. So we need somehow to get the item into this component, okay. We can guess that at some point, probably the item ID, so we know that, for example, we're going to need from our data.js file, we're going to need the list of items, right? Because the one that we want to display is in there somewhere, right? What we want to be able to do is receive some information about which one it is, and then be able to pull it out. Okay, get that item out of this array. Okay, so let's tackle that first. We know that we need to create the item object, and it's going to come out of the items array. what's a method that we can use to find what we're looking for in the array? I might or might not have just given you the answer. Okay, map. Map, not a bad idea. But map, essentially what map is supposed to do is take each element, run it through some kind of transformation, and then give us back another array, right? So we don't really want to do that. I think find is the right answer, right? So Sean got it, and Mohammed got it as well. We want to do find, and here's the thread as well. I think there's some other folks that mentioned it, Derek and Sean Courtney. Find is the right answer, right? So we're going to do find. And kind of like map, find is going to iterate over the array until it finds a match. And so we want to give it a callback. And the way that that callback is going to work is it's going to take the, we'll call it thing just so it doesn't interfere with our other. We're going to take each item and we're going to pass it into a function. And all our function is going to do is compare thing ID, the ID that comes out of the data file. Again, if we look in the data file, every one of these items has an ID, right? We want to compare it to something. The question is, what are we comparing it to? Well, we can guess that probably the right thing to do would be to pass the right ID into props, right? So we know that here in index, or rather in, let's see, we want to be able to have a route that's going to show our item component based on something in the URL. Okay, so help me think about this. How could we go about doing this? We've got roughly a dozen different items, and when we click on one of them, we want it to show up. Okay, let's double check over here for more questions. Nobody's using Slido today, which is fine. If you've got some ideas, share them with me. What do you think we would do? Okay, our key is going to get information from the item, so we still haven't gotten the item yet. Right, so here, in this case, we're iterating over it. So we could use, yeah, the key, but that's actually a property of this div. And so that's not going to be accessible to us in our component. Right, so what this is doing is creating each one of these. But when I click on this, I want to do something with it. Someone says there's questions in Slido. Oh, you know what? I'm not looking at the right thing. Thank you for helping me with that, Brian. I had the wrong display up. Guys, give me a minute. I'm going to run through these because I've been ignoring these accidentally, and I need to get through them. So I'm going to take just a pause on what we're trying to do here, and let me clear some of these up. Yes, progressive web application was what I was talking about before. So progressive web app is kind of like a single page app, but one of its key pieces of functionality is that it can work offline, and it also has some access to native elements, and it's something worth learning. I don't know if it's part of the courseware at Lambda, but it's definitely something worth digging into. It's kind of a newer concept. Debugger is a statement that causes the built-in debugger built into the browser to break on that, to basically stop execution. So when it sees the statement debugger, it stops execution and it shows you where you are in the code, so that you can take a look at different properties, values of different variables that exist at that time in that closure. And even step through your code one step at a time when you're trying to debug something. So it's a very powerful thing that lets you get a real-time, in-the-flow look at what's happening in your application without only relying on console.log. So hopefully that answers that question. And the next one, which is what is a debugger doing exactly? And the TK, they mentioned how we shouldn't mess with the history method. Not sure what the context is for that. I'm going to save that question so I can go to the TK and see exactly what it is, and then I can maybe answer that in context. I don't have an answer off the top of my head there. Can you add media queries to React apps via regular CSS? I'm not sure what you mean by media query. Feel free to expand on that question, and I'll see if I can give a more meaningful answer to that. Chromeless is basically a full screen view. Yes, that's exactly what I would say. And yeah, I think there might be a way to prevent from toggling out of Chromeless. I've not looked into that, but there may be a way to prevent that. Next question, how do you use XML data to display on the web page? Browsers don't typically use XML for user interface elements. It's more for data exchange, but so I'm not sure if I'm understanding that question directly. You can view an XML document, but you see the tags and everything. It doesn't display, doesn't render elements of graphical elements the way that HTML does. Is routing faster and more efficient than regular HTML? Absolutely is. Hopefully we've seen that demonstrated. And when we say routing, we're talking about client-side routing. Okay. Server-side routing is the same thing as HTML, because what you get back is HTML that you then have to re-render. Would Code Sandbox be considered client-side routing? I would be surprised if Code Sandbox was not using that concept in its functionality. You can imagine all the things that you're doing with it. Everything that it needed to do to update the screen constantly depended on communicating back with the server just to get back a little chunk of visual element, it would be a nightmare for them to manage on the back end, and it would be a nightmare to use as well. So I'm certain that they're doing some client-side routing there. What does consumer and producer refer to? Not really sure. It's something I'm curious about as well, but I don't have an answer for that. I've not dug into React Router that deeply, but I'll see what I can find out and maybe provide some notes later on, because I am kind of curious about that myself. Sure that there are concepts for how they're laying out their components. Why couldn't we name the home route, for example, /home? Yeah, you could. You could name it that if you wanted. You would still want to display something when you don't do /home, when you just do a slash. So you need some component for your root, and but you can call it whatever you want. Media query for responsiveness. So the question is, can we add media queries to React apps via regular CSS? You can. In fact, as we talked about last time, when you do React Strap, it's using Bootstrap, and the ability to be responsive through CSS is all Bootstrap is about. And so in reality, React Strap is using Bootstrap, which is using CSS to do that. So if they can do it, we can do it, right? So absolutely, you can do that. Okay. All right. Thanks for the let me take a little hiatus there. We'll get back to what we want to do here. So hopefully you've had a chance to kind of struggle with this a little bit. But what I want to kind of do is point our minds towards sort of the React Router way of solving this problem. There's a number of other ways without React Router that we could think to accomplish this, right? If I were to click on that, then maybe using a state object and data passing between different components, we could accomplish what we need to do with this. But using React Router, essentially, we want the display to be driven by the URL, which means when we click on it, the URL should change, and based on what the URL is, that should determine what we see. So we know that each one of these items, and somebody mentioned key, I think it was Natalie mentioned key property on these, because it's pointed to the item ID. It's the item ID in reality that we're interested in, right? So when we click on each one of these, we want to be able to change the URL, which will cause React Router to change the user interface. We just need to change the URL in a way that has the ID in it. And then we need our item component to know what that ID is, okay? So we mentioned before that, you know, when we come into here, I've clicked on shops, I'm looking at this here, and if I go into components and expand these components out, okay? And when I look at this one, I get this information over here, right? And one of the things that I can see is the path or the URL, right? So I can get information, and you can see something here called params. So one thing that I could do is I could make a link that has the ID in it, and then somehow I can parse that ID out of the URL, right? So if it says /item-list/1, for example, and then inside my my card component, this thing here, I said, you know, I need to compare thing.id to something. It would be, you know, I'd have to go through the URL and pull that out, right? So in my props, I know that in my props I have a match object, and inside of that is a path object, and inside, and then the value of that is the actual path. So if I could make it so that by clicking on one of these, it changed the URL to something like this. Okay, this is not going to work because that doesn't match anything. Okay, just comes back with the same thing. But if I could make it so that it comes back with that, and I have a route that matches this, right? Then I can make that work. So then all I would have to do in my index is something like this. See where I'm going with this? What would be the problem with this approach, though? If I could do this, and then I could say, if it looks like that, then I want to show maybe the item component, right? And then, of course, I need to bring that in. Okay, so it's hard-coded and it's tedious. It's not dry. Very good. They would all be stuffed into your nav. Okay, so that could be an issue. It's too static, right? So if I actually pointed this to a database that could have a variety of different objects in it, there's no way that I can handle that, right? So I need a way to kind of do this maybe in a templated fashion, right? So if I did it this way, then I could come into my item, and I know that in my item component, it's going to have a match object that has /item-list/1, for example. And then in my item code, I could extract that out of the URL because I'd get it out of my properties, and then I could use it to compare, right? But for these other reasons, we don't want to do it that way, right? So the way that we're going to do it is with what's known as dynamic routing, okay? And instead of a hard-coded ID here, what we're going to do is we're going to use a syntax that allows us to templatize it, okay? So Christian got it there, right? So when we do a colon and then some variable name, what ends up happening is that the value that shows up in this place, in this location, ends up being part of the match params property, right? So in props, which gets passed into our item component function, there's a property called match, inside of which is another property called params, which will contain that templated ID, okay? And the variable name or the property name will be what we choose here. So in this case, it's going to be ID, but I could make it my ID, or I could make it the ID, Whatever I call it here, that's going to be the name of the variable that shows up in this parameters object inside of match, which is in our props. So that way, in my item, I can access props.match.params.id, or the ID, or my ID, right? I'm just going to call it ID because it makes sense. Okay, so now we've got it completed here, and over here in our index file, we have a route that will cause our item component to be displayed. So if the route matches this, okay, now we can see that this is also going to match this, right? So in order to separate those, we need to make this one exact. So that way with just item list, we get the item list component, which is what we're seeing here. But if it's item list / something, it's going to show the item component. Okay. And in the item component, whatever comes after the item list in the URL is going to be passed in as a parameter in the match object, which is in our props. Okay. And the browser router wrapper that we put around our app is what makes sure that the match object is in our props, in our component. Every component inside is going to get this object, and we'll have access to anything that's in the URL. One thing that I'll mention as well, I won't demonstrate this, but you can kind of play around with this if you want. If we look at index, I could continue this URL and say more stuff, another ID with a colon. Okay, so if I had multiple places in my URL where there's some dynamic data that can change, each one of these is going to be pulled into that params collection in the match object inside props. Okay, so we'll have access to them there. Okay, of course we don't want that in this case. We just want our ID. Okay, so now in our item, we're going to be retrieving that item using our find, and once we have it, then all of these properties will be filled in to our card. Okay, you can see here that the route and the link are not being used in the card at all. Does it need it? The way that the card is getting any of that information is through the props, through the match params ID. Okay, we'll save that. We'll save this. So now, if we do item list /1, it should work, right? Oh, we got a problem. The problem is that the image URL is not a property that can be found on undefined. So if we look at item here, we've got some kind of problem where this is coming back as undefined. Okay, and this is kind of treated in the TK a little bit because we're running a little bit short on time. I'm going to short circuit it and just tell you what the problem is here, rather than make you kind of noodle it out. But the problem is that we've got these 3 equals, which means these have to be exactly matching. Okay, now in one case we're using a 1, and the other case, if we look at our data file, it is 1. So how could they be different if they're identical? The type, right? Exactly right. So in one case it's a number, and the other case it's a string. And it turns out that in the case of the data coming out of our data file, it's a number. In the case of what's coming out of our URL, it's a string. So we could handle it by not doing an exact match, but by allowing JavaScript to modify it. You can see we're already getting a complaint here. The linter does not like the fact that we did that. That's because it's dangerous. We can end up with some challenges. So really what we need to do is we just need to either change this into a string or change this into a number. So we could, for example, do number like this. Okay. And then if we saved it, now notice when we put the number 1 in, it finds it and we get our display, right? If we did 2, we would get that one. If we did 0, we would get that one. If we did something that's not a number, then we get an error, right? So we'd have to do some error handling in case somebody put in the wrong URL, okay? But now that we have the ability to get a dynamic URL that pulls, that flows that dynamic piece of data into our component here, and then the component can use it to figure out what to fill up its data with, or its elements with. Now all we need to do is figure out how we can get there by doing a click on something. So we've got a question here in Slido. Please explain props.match.params.id again. Okay, so remember that props is what's being passed into our function. And because we wrapped our entire application in the browser router, there are some properties that are going to be passed to every component. We can add additional properties, but these are properties that React Router is going to add for us. One of those properties is a property called match. And that match object, if we want to look here, let's see. Where can I find match? Well, you can find it in the documentation here. Here it is here, match. Okay, so the match object contains a number of different properties itself that we can use. It contains the URL, which is the matched portion of the URL. It contains the path, which is the pattern that was used to match, whether or not it was an exact match, and any parameters that the key value pairs that it pulled out of the URL itself. Right, so this match object is passed to every component that's inside a browser router container. And so in our case, that includes this item component. And so we're able to get the match, look at the params, and any parameters that it pulled out of the URL, which is that colon syntax. Right, so hopefully that answered that question. Okay, so now, now that we're getting this, we need to add a link to the pictures, right? So if we come back over here, each one of these things needs to have a link. And what we'll do is we'll take the item name and we'll surround it in a link, okay? And the link, again, takes a to property, which tells us where we want to go, right? So we don't want to go to item list / ID. Okay, if we tell it to go to that URL, it's going to end up breaking our app. Okay, so if we type that in here, it's not going to work. What we need, rather, is we need to get this in there as part of the link, right? But we need to interpolate it like this, because again, that's an item that comes out of JavaScript land. Okay. But because we're putting this in a string, we actually need to do the whole thing in curly brackets, right? And if that's the case, then we need to use a template literal. And then inside a template literal, we can use the brackets to pull a variable name in. So once we're inside these curly braces, it's just a JavaScript expression. The expression we're using is a template literal. And just like any other template literal, you can take the value of a variable and make it part of the string, right? So our to address is going to be /item-list/ and then whatever the value of this item ID is. Okay. And then we'll put this in there. Oh, and the reason that this is not working is because we don't have link defined. So we need to import it. We'll import link from React router DOM. Okay, so now we've got our thing back, and the name should be clickable. So if I click on this, if you look in the lower left-hand corner of my browser, in fact, I'll come over here and if I just rest my mouse over that, you'll see down at the bottom the different URLs, okay, that are coming in. And we've already tested these, so we know that they will work. And if I go back, I get this instant behavior because React router, the browser router, is using the history API to be able to manage our browser history, and that's allowing it to not have to refresh every page when we go through. All right. I like these glasses, by the way. If they're really for sale, I may pick them up. All of this stuff seems to come off a website called Uncommon Goods. So there may be some cool stuff to pick up there if it's a real website. I haven't looked at it. But somebody mentioned the taco holders before. Those are all pretty cool. All right, so just to review our objectives for tonight. Pull this back over here, go back up to the top. Explain the first purpose of client-side routing. We've managed that. Adding React router to an application. Inside Code Sandbox, you add it as a dependency. Inside create React app application on your local machine. You first need to do yarn to pull down all the dependencies, and then yarn add React router DOM in order to get that to come in. We've talked about the route component, and we've used it. We talked about the link component, and we've used it. And now we've just finished talking about dynamic routes and how to use that together with the match object. There's much more that we'll need to cover as we dig into React Router 2 coming forward. Very cool. Thanks, Paul. Drop shipping store. Good to hear. So thank you for that. So yeah, so we've accomplished this. Hopefully it made sense. You'll get my notes a little later tonight, maybe. I've got to get up at 3 o'clock in the morning to catch an airplane, and so I might be heading home just to get some sleep, and I might do it on the plane tomorrow. But you'll get them as soon as I can get them to you. And in addition, just be aware that I'll be on that same plane, probably heading back home during class on Thursday. And so a different instructor has agreed to take my class on Thursday for the second part of React Router. He's good and experienced, so you'll have a good time with him. His name's Dan. Some of you may know him, but he's graciously agreed to take my class on Thursday, and I'll miss being with you guys, but look forward to that. And then my notes as soon as I can get them to you. And let me just, yes, Dan Frenner, that's right. And then I'll get back to this question about not messing with the history method. I didn't catch that in the TK, so I'll dig into that and find out what the issue with that is. Thanks for the wishes, and thank you, Natalie. You guys are awesome. All right, with that, I will wish you a good night. We've got 1 minute left, so I'll give you a minute to spare, and I hope you guys have a great night and a great week, and we will catch you all next week. Thanks, guys.